¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us on this third and last panel of this week regarding our platform that as you know, establishes MOAC in a collaboration of partners. It has been really interesting to join so many diverse voices around a topic and such a particular urgency that has to do with memory, specifically connected to digitality. We will close this first part of the program with this panel today. You can find heritage in a bit, all the talks on the website. The pandemic has enabled us to see different ways in which internet and social networks work. And this encounter, this chat, will be conducted in several parts. This first part had panels, live panels. Further on, we will also broadcast the recordings. I also suggest you to visit the website and consider to enroll, to register on the website. And in January, we will continue this debate, this collective reflection, and we will close that first part of this event where several people and instances have joined. Let me remind you that you can follow this chat through the MOAC website on Facebook. On Facebook, you will be able to follow this talk in Spanish, and on YouTube, you will be able to follow this in English with English interpretation. You will be able to join the conversation through any of these platforms, sending your questions. This is a great panel today, the panel that we have today. The panel has different profiles, different generations. We believe that they will be able to bring together very different perspectives artistically. Remember that this event is held in MOAC, the University Museum, and the heritage and all the concepts that are related with this talk play a very important role today. Artistic production also plays a very important role. Curators are deeply concerned. I have not introduced myself. My name is Henaro. I am a curator in the museum, and we are interested because of the profile of our museum, memory policies. We're very interested on listening what our guests will talk about. Let me tell you very briefly about our participants today. Tania Aedo is the coordinator of the Max Aub chair. She was director of Art Alameda and the Multimedia Center in Mexico City. Andrew Roberts works in Mexico City and Tijuana. He does multimedia narrative and space through animation. And Brian Mackern develops hybrid and digital pieces. He's also a musician and an artist. I please ask our guests to open their cameras. Thank you very much on behalf of MOAC and the university. I thank you for accepting our invitation, and feel free to share your ideas with us. Tania Aedo will take the floor first, then Andrew and Brian will close the conversation. Feel free to express your honest opinions. Dear Tania, please open your mic. Thank you. Hello, dear soul. It's great to be here. I'm really happy to be here with you all. I wanted to begin by sharing my thoughts based on the structure that you prepared. I played with some sort of unboxing with two books and exhibitions, different projects that come up with a book, an archive, and an exhibition that all come together in this project. These are two documentaries, Ready Media from 2010 and an heterophony from 2009. I was interested on highlighting from those projects the fact that, first of all, the selection of the projects, which is connected to Ready Media, where we had 8 curators from different disciplines, and they were asked to do a critical reading of the Center for Documentation Losada. And not the museums, but the Center Alameda, which was not opened as a museum and did not have the goal to protect an archive. But in the end, the collective curatorial process aims at creating this archive to actually become a true archive with materials, but on the long run also aims at protecting the archive itself. Because as you know, it is not that there is one institution interested in preserving this forever. It is a political fight over memory, really. And ways of listening, this project, Modos de Oír, more than 10 years later, has more or less the same characteristic. I'm interested in highlighting this in both projects, and I want to emphasize the fact that how powerful it is in terms of it has, well, especially when you have projects like this, projects that ended up being an anthology. So I think it is very important for that reason. I would also like to share my screen very quickly. Well, actually, I think we said we would not share our screen, but if it's possible, I would like to share my screen for a minute. The way in which I use the archive as an imaginary repository based on the knowings and the warnings and the criticisms within the archive, and based on the realization of this boundary, this limit, when we realized we were in a pandemic, and before that, an earthquake, and before that, the global crisis. All of these reasons are the machinery and the excuse to think about the archive and what we would do with this in the event of a contingency, and also the role of these practices in a special situation. I will stop sharing my screen. I will just leave that idea. I just wanted to share these three moments, these three steps in, regarding the archive, which is the role as an art manager that I am, and also the role that I have as a curator in the Max Aub chair. And I just wanted to highlight how I am using this archive and how we are thinking about emergencies in the present and the future, and this special um, future that we're living. I would love to go on with this conversation later on. Yes, thank you, Tania. I think in your case, it has been really interesting because you have led two very important institutions, uh, which were called the New Medium, the Alameda and the CNA and CNA, the National Art Center in Mexico City. There was this view, there was this feeling that people wanted to protect. It has been difficult. It has been difficult for these elements to find their spot. They're really very young. They were really formed in the late 90s. And well, once these spaces were created, how first how it was very frustrating to see how, as curators, we have guarded all of that, and then we need to be part of a pandemic and then refrain from attending this place that was really difficult to create. I remember that recently you recovered work by Jose Luis Nava from the 90s, which was incredible to be able to restitute and actually being able to see that work on the big screen at the National Movie Theater in Cineteca Nacional. You also talk about the pandemic and about other crises that highlight the vulnerability of the memory. And that makes me think and leads me actually to introducing Andrew. I read about Andrew very briefly, but Andrew, with the video that he has on the website, that well, you can see it on the website. This video with all the fire reminds us of the vulnerability of the files, of the memory, of how this element of disappearance is present every time. Hello, Andrew. Welcome. Hello. Thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. The video that I have on the website has to do with the memory. And actually, my goal is to revisit or make a historic view of our memory. Because, for example, it's very difficult to think about war ignoring the development of video games, for example, considering especially that many technologies of wireless communications, augmented reality, etc., they were really first tested in the military. And working based on that, the project that is right now on the website is a piece, a part of a bigger project that I'm developing on my two grandparents. One of my grandparents was American, and he was a soldier. He lived in the military. And my other grandfather, my mother's grandfather, well, on my mother's side, he manufactured guns. Pedro Barrios, my Mexican grandfather, worked in a company that was a subsidiary from Remington, from the company Remington, and they manufactured guns and gunpowder. So this moment, while my grandfather was manufacturing guns outside Cuernavaca in Mexico, while my other grandfather, my American grandfather, was using those guns in the military. My American grandfather decided, when he left the military, he decided to burn his house. He lived near Tijuana, and at the same time, nearly around the same time, my Mexican grandfather, while working on his manufacturing facility, had a fire. So from the micro story, from the micro history and the narrative, it was very important for me to show how ironic this situation is. And based on personal narratives and personal stories, I wanted to show this burning house and the ability to create, to recreate the past, and as a way of healing the past. And well, really all that I have to say in this chat is, well, it has to do with video games and other tools that help us um, relive the past. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I insist. Fire. Those of us who deal with policies of memory, fire is always the image that threatens. You know, it's that space of danger. But in your practice, I wonder what is that element that endangers your practice? Maybe it's not the fire, literally the fire, but what would you say is the vulnerability in your work, in your productions? I remember that in another artistic practice, quote unquote traditional, I had, well, uh, bidimensional elements. And I remember comments from artists saying, how are we going to preserve this? They were like, okay, that is not my problem. It will be the problem of the institution or the curator. I I think more about the electronic um, and the way in which we preserve archives today. How are we going to preserve that legacy in terms of the future and the time ahead? It is also very interesting to me how you recover your personal story to create a new piece, to create a new artistic manifestation. We will go back to this point later on, but well, right now let me introduce Brian. Brian, in a way, defends the idea of the remix. Throughout the sessions that we've had these days, we've talked about fossils, cemeteries, and obsolescence. And these are images that talk about. We don't talk about them a lot because of what they make us think. Now, in the case of Brian, he has this need, this urgency of having, the professionals, because we didn't have the professionals thinking about these problems, and he began to explore new territories. It was more or less when the figure of the curator was born. The first curators were artists, and but but then there was the need to talk about art from art itself. So I would say it is, you know, this strategy of reliving something or having something so it lives on is very interesting. I was I was thinking about this concept of rivolita, rivolire. It is, this Italian concept of boiling something again, because that's what it means. It means to cook again or to boil again. Brian talks about this really on the website. Yes, we want to make all the work for this production to live, but how the artistic production today can enable them a second life, let's say. So thank you, Brian. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, thank you so much. I'm really thankful for the invitation to talk about these questions and passions, really, because, you know, that fire that guides us. And well, like Tania, my interest has to do with the archive and the digital, really. It was one of the very first thing that really had an impact on my work when I started working with the virtual work. The remix, well, let me go back. I want to go back to the idea that Tania mentioned. It was that thing that Tania talked about in the Latin American arts in Mexico, really important in the new arts, the digital arts. Uh, the lab that she mentioned was really powerful, really important back in its time. The support of institutions, you know, sometimes how they are like tides going up and down, and it depends a lot on how willing they are on supporting some manifestations. Like Tania, and as she knows, curators join these archives and support them or not. In my case, a digital archive. The topic of the remix has always been an interest of mine because I always I was always attracted to the idea of accessing lost universes. And within the musical universe, I remember the US folk archive. I could access that because I started listening to some pieces, some samples that I used from field recordings that I used for a project. And thanks to an interview and how Lomax was telling me how he had done the remix and everything, I could access all those recordings and other musicians. For example, musicians that sometimes they recover some recordings, some vinyl recording, and I don't know, they, you know, in the time of Woodstock, when Avándaro, you know, and when you start researching those things, sometimes you have like only 4 bars, you start accessing, uh, I call it a molecule or an atom of cultural information that comes from the far past. And that opens a door to access, I don't know, obscure bands, for example, from the 60s or the 50s. And that leads us to old uh, scenes, you know, that existed. And I don't know, maybe through samples that last 8 seconds or 5 seconds, and they take you back 60 or 70 years. Within digital art, what happens specifically in med art, we grew up in a very free way. There was never an institutional contention, luckily. We were very lucky because it was really difficult to express or to describe the digital object and to express it. And as I was saying, we grew up in our own way, you know, the way that we wanted. We became our own managers. And I don't mean our scene, but everyone's scene. even the scene of our colleagues, and it forced us to research and see who were the members of the collective groups. And we had, well, very different scenes. Net art, I mentioned it a little bit. It is the result of really all the experimentation of the last century. Net art is the result of people who were coming from sound arts and visual arts, and there were designers, and there were writers, and there were musicians, etc., etc. Net art was the result of people from the performance, from, you know, really people from very, very different backgrounds. And that is why it is so difficult to make a catalog and say what net art is. So it is really difficult. It is really fragile. It's difficult to say what is net art, what it is not. I always play with the phrase, well, paraphrasing Zappa. He used to say, jazz is not dead, it just smells funny. I always say net art is not dead, net art just smells funny. Because we have so many things. It's all the democracy that we talked about in the 90s. I'm really convinced that that already happened and we are all generating things. Of course, there is a certain perversion there because the the ways of technology, there is also the market, the technological market, and you're always playing on that border, on that frontier. In the 90s, we used to talk about the users, someone trying to learn, someone trying to manipulate and trying to understand what is the digital and what is the virtual and what is the technology that he uses. But now you have the prosumer who is within a black box at his cell phone. He has no idea how it works because the market has already exceeded that, because we don't have to configure, we don't have to learn how to configure our cell phones. Things get configured on their own, even even without wanting us. You have new apps downloaded. uh, your phone doesn't even ask you. So we have this consumer, this figure of the consumer who don't really question the mean, they just serve the mean. It is interesting in that, there, it is interesting to point through the reflection. On the video that is, that you're, uh, well, on the video that I presented, I was very seduced by the fragility of all this concept. And little by little, I've developed, a know-how on how to preserve things. That is why on the video I have, the artistic side and the more serious um, aspect, where, well, I talk about techniques, not too much, but I talk about techniques. Mainly due to time constraints, I don't expand too much, but I talk about the framework. I would say I am more serious, let's say. Thank you, Brian. You can all open your screen, your camera, if you want. I think that now, after this last comment uh, of Brian, I believe that we belong to two different generational blocks. Brian, Tania, and I saw the big, the appearance of digital arts, that hammer of digital arts coming to the reality, and then we lived like the hangover of this wonder. And now we're wondering, and we're, thinking about things like how do you collect, how do you store, etc. And in this new generation, as you said, Brian, artists really just serve that reality, that wave. And it is our role to question what is the importance and the role of institutions, for example. Thinking about all of these necessities, these collective exercises to create a history, a collective history regarding these practices. They have all been different. They have been collective practices that, well, there are these are thoughts that grow older very quickly, especially because of the agency that we are uh, bringing together. I was also thinking about the obsolescence, not only of technology, which is related to the topic of this forum, but also the obsolescence of some categories that change. When I listen to the word net art, I I wonder, is Brian just an artist in the broad sense? I remember we used to talk about video ast, and people saying I'm this very specifically. I don't know, Brian, how do you place yourself? How do you uh, how or where do you place yourself? And I was also thinking about something that was present in your three participations. For example, do not associate Derrida with death. Do we really need to preserve everything? Do we? I was thinking while I was listening to you, to all three of you, I was thinking about Anna Morphine. She, well, we recently talked about the art action. And she was telling me, we go through art action. The action is gone. We see the pictures, the videos, the narration. We see everything. We know action, but through documents. And she was saying that maybe we would need to re reenact and relive the oral tradition, because these artistic traditions, I wonder what would the document have to be that we need to access, because we're always scratching the the ideal media to reach immortality. I would like to just leave that idea, and I don't know who would like to follow up.
Con mucho gusto.
Tanya, do you want to talk?
Pues muy estimulantes tus
Well, yes,
reflexiones,
your
Axel. Me gusta mucho también
comments,
que traigas
your thoughts
esta
are very
cuestión
stimulating.
de lo
So
generacional, porque sí pienso que por un lado
I
se tiene que volver a
I
leer
think
y
the
eso darle
generation,
su propia interpretación y
the
saber más. Bueno,
everything
otras
that you
personas
said
trabajan sobre
about
estas mismas
the
obras
contrast of generations, I think
y
it's
eso
very
es uno
important, very interesting.
sí, de los procesos más interesantes en
I
esto.
think
Luego
yes, it
escuchar
is
que ha tenido esta
a very
esta
important part of this
la
process.
participación
And
en
then the
esta
role of
metodología que
fire
nos estaba mostrando que tiene
and
que ver más con
connected
entropía
to the
y tiempo,
entropy,
¿no? Cómo la entropía,
and
cómo
also
las
with
variables
time, and how
que podría,
entropy
es lo que nos permite dar cuenta de
is
algo
what
que no
allows
está,
us
¿no?
to
Lo
realize
desgastamos y es así que
this
entonces
concept
pues pueden,
of time.
las cosas se rompen y se desquebrajan
You realize
y
that after you're
se
50,
desvanecen y
you
desaparecen
realize that
y
things
entonces
just
esto permite la
disappeared, they
conservación y el
break,
sostenimiento de la vida y ahí creo que
and
el
then,
tiempo juega
but then
un
you
papel me
have,
parece muy interesante
the
y
wish
como
to
tematizar otra vez también esta idea
protect
de muerte
and to
y
archive and
¿no?
to care for next
Entonces,
generations.
eso es lo que diría ahora. Y
I would
sí,
say that
este,
makes me think about that moment of
como
crisis.
parte de tu reflexión con
Also,
respecto a las plataformas que
this
permiten
reflection is
hacer
interesting
eventos
because
como esto,
you know
sí
how
es parte
platforms become obsolete, and well, this is not the natural entropy, and this is not the natural death. It is something like the the imagine that the guy who would sell the paintings and the boards to Rembrandt, for example. Imagine if he would be the feudal lord who would really, it's really, art today is, it really makes you think. It is how art is supported on technology, but then the creators of technology want you to do certain things. Now you have to do that with new technologies, and then you have new variables. It's really very interesting. The museum has to now be open to other ways of not being a museum, but I think it's really important because really no one else is thinking about the role of the museum. So it's great that the museum is thinking of its new roles itself. Shall I go? Okay. Let me continue. Yes, I think it's really, really interesting what you have been saying. It's really important within this material that we're talking about. I remember the virtual space was that space where we would go in and out, but now we are virtual everywhere, and all the time we're virtual. We live virtual. We are we are a part of the virtual. We don't go in and out. We are part of the virtual space. We are ourselves virtual. Regarding my work, I always like to connect this Japanese tradition where they repair broken pots with gold. Once a pot is broken, how they uh, repair it using gold, and it's really an art, and you create a new object, a new artistic object. And what I was thinking is there is not a literally in the recovery of an archive. I always see an archive, but I always repair and care that archive through my contemporary view. It's really strange to say contemporary when 20 years have passed, but because the world now changes completely every 2 or 3 years, and sometimes it goes back to really old things, and then you realize that it's some sort of a deja vu where you see those market proposals that already existed, that were new 20 years ago or more. This, it's like second life what they're talking about. That was discussed in the 80s, and you're trying to bring it back. So anyways, there is this part of myself of recovering the archive and putting it together, and maybe creating Frankenstein of the old archive in order to create a new archive. And then I also have this completely obsessive, compulsive way of looking at my materials. I have more than 40 hard disk drives with things that I have found. I'm always finding new things and keeping them exactly as I found them. When the institutions began to realize, for example, remember the bubble, the dot-com bubble uh, these were really heavy things connected to money issues, and people started to see the dot-com um, and the digital uh, things. They began to grow in itself. I remember people, you would buy a CD-ROM in a market, and they would even sell it as if they were going to live forever. And now you find that computers aren't able to read those CDs, right? When you see these pieces, now you wonder what are you supporting, what are you archiving. You need the systems now to preserve the old pieces. Now the pieces are really numbers, bits, but they need the technology to live on. And that is something that I'm really obsessed about, that I'm really interested in. How to how to preserve and how to reconsider those files, because they are files now, and how to allow them to live on. Also, something that I'm really interested in is recovering the context, because it's not recovering the piece itself, but you need to recover the context. Remember, um, I don't know, the paranoia that we had 20 or 25 years ago with viruses, with computer viruses, because there was this fear of, if what happened if you received a message with a virus, that it would crash your entire computer. Uh, so you need to recover the piece itself, but also the context and the personal environment, the personal context of the artist, and what was he thinking about? What was he or she living in his or her society at that time? For example, we were all panicking. For example, at the end of the 90s, we were afraid of what would happen in Y2K, with year 2000, when all the computers were going to crash at the same time, and we were going to lose our banking information and be left with no technologies. And well, all of that was recovered. All of that part is recovered through the interview, right? So that is really a very important part of the archive. So it's recovering the file itself, but then the file, how you need to recover the file within its technological context, but also with the personal context of the artist that led him or her to create that piece, that file. That is right now what I would like to talk about that. Regarding the concept of fire, well, just recently, you know, the Cinemateca of San Pablo uh, was burned. We have had serious issues. Um, of course, the digital is always a little bit behind, I think, because how can I put it? It is complex. There was this time in the 90s where maybe I'm, you know, going astray, but I, the digitalized object was thrown away. I remember once you digital, once you made something digital, for example, you scanned the paper and then the paper was thrown away, because people were people were thinking, well, once this is digital, we don't need the support, we don't need the paper. And that was crazy. That was really crazy. But those things happened, fires, real or metaphoric, that led to the destruction of many original objects because they were digitalized, right? Okay, I would like to answer Sol's question. I think that now that you mentioned the generation part and how you could go in and out of the digital, and now we're virtual all the time. Concepts like the Second Life, for example, or Sims is, you know, taking elements from video games and trying to incorporate them in real life, having like a competition system and how to create and how to transform that into a cute dynamic. That's when I think that the digital is not so much a medium, it's really just a sensitivity. It's a sensitivity that goes that overflows the media. We are seeing a generation gap, of course, but it's we're going out of 2 years where the reality has been mediated through screens for all of us. And the new artists that have lived this net art, and they're thinking on how to preserve that, how to archive that, but also thinking about the market and the needs of the market, and how children that grew up or that were born in the late 90s, who accessed online stores where you buy clothes for your avatar, and how that has a real commercial value. And there's sensitivity. It's like they don't even question that. They for them it is real. They don't think that their sword is made of bits and their clothing is made of bits. For them it is real because they grew up with that. We used to think that the virtual is something that we don't access, is that something that was far away. For the new generation, the virtual is really real. It is a part of their lives. Only when you take a step back, you realize that it is, just phones and computers and machines. But for the new generation, this is real. This world, this virtual world is real. I was also thinking about how the digital, um, it is not really just putting them on a warehouse. I can think, for example, I'm thinking about Minecraft, this game where you build things with blocks, like Lego blocks. There is an archive, a library with many documents and archives, or also Animal Crossing. And sometimes they store art pieces there. We should also think on how to share all of this that has been digital, but taking it out, I suppose, things that have existed in the real life, but also in the virtual, that would be attractive for the young audience, for the younger audience. In my case, there is this very sensual, libidinal aspect of the images because, you know, i- it is now this idea that images should be created in a way that they are attractive, but they should also be critic because they are critic of both the image itself and the programs and the hands that created them in the end. And well, I think that, well, yeah, fantastic, Andrew. That's great because it makes us think about the urgency of how people who work in institutions, people who are committed with the memory, what things we need to think about to socialize contents for the newer generations. We saw it with the pandemic in a very clear, very emphatic way. This desire, I was thinking that I was going to grow old very fast, and I wanted to do um, virtual exhibits. And, I think personally, they don't work. They make you dizzy. You know, when you try to imitate the physical space, I was really generating more questions than answers. I thought that they were going to grow old really quickly. And then I started to see new projects like Tania Candiani. She did a project where they created some sort of a museum of social objects during the pandemic. They were saying, for example, the new feminists going out on the streets and using these programs that you're talking about, Andrew. How could they communicate to the newer generations the fact or the things that were being lost on the public space? Um, those who think that contemporary art is boring, you have no idea how stressful it is to think about these um, all of these elements. I always think about how to professionalize the medium. We have had to accompany that. Well, I mean, uh, sometimes they ask you DVDs, for example, um, and then but in the older times it was really the same. They would give you all the elements and the blocks, but they wouldn't tell you how to make the installation. I always work from the files, from the archives. And in the words of Brian, I am a resuscitator now. But when you think about catalogs and cataloging, there are so many questions. When Brian talks about the techno system and the source code and this and that, you think, wow, really? Who are the researchers that are uh, trained enough, that really have that vocabulary to really drain all these projects, really archive these projects and catalog that? Because cataloging is really a research activity and has to do on thinking how the people from future generations will be able to access these materials. When you listen to Brian, you could write a PhD dissertation after listening to Brian, because he makes you wonder all of those things. We, the people in the institutions, need to accompany all that. When multimedia was born, there was like throwing the responsibility to the institutions and saying, okay, this is the new ghetto. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they're going to do it. But no, we cannot think like that anymore. It is everyone's responsibility, because that type of productions, they live everywhere. We saw that after the pandemic, you know, connected with all the contents that were created during the pandemic. It is now our responsibility to archive that, to protect that. The lab won't do it. The institutions won't do it. It is our responsibility to care for that, to protect that. And it's the terror that you would search and get the not found, file not found. The terror, the panic that you get when you're looking for a file and you get file not found. File not found was the terror. It meant that you could not find it in the universe. It's fire. It's really fire. File not found was fire. Well, I can think about how the National Movie Archive uh, was consumed by the flames, and so many other places. When I think about the post-net art, hard disks and the cloud, and what can we do to prevent that fire that threatens us permanently? Would you like to go into a last round of comments? Who would like to start? Yes, well, what you're saying is true. Is incredibly complex. When you see the institutions that are part of this, they have 20 people teams. These are great teams. For example, we were talking about Ana Morfin, who conducted a seminar in Mexico a few years ago. They were all the gurus of digital conservation and multimedia, uh, but they were describing, it was a before and after. There was this guy who was specialized on the diskette and how you would put it on in the computer. If it is a new computer, the new computer overwrites the diskette, so that is not right. So you need to open that diskette in an old computer, and they really go into the detail, the really the very specific details. There are people specialized on everything. It's hallucinating. It's really complex. You really need very, very uh, well interdisciplinary teams to make this work. I believe that no institution, at least the ones I know, they all have uh, problems like fire, for example, things that have not been solved, of course, but they are also, you know, related with worth. That is worth, well, it is, of course, this new emerging media, for example. But in the end, the long chain is what gives you the value, but it is not the object itself, because the object is everywhere. It's really the bits and the connection and the object itself. We all have it. It is not the object anymore. I remember this guy that came out with all the torrents and collected into just one. And the digital pieces themselves, they're digital, they're everywhere. It's what is valuable in NFT is the blockchain. But well, fundamentally, I think that, well, there is no institutional budget that can support a work like this. And then, like Andrew was saying, it's the bringing these files to life. For example, going through Fire or generating like a dopamine state with likes and all that. I don't know, maybe you could do your own online remix, for example, in an online museum. You know how there are museums where you can be your own curator and choose everything that you want, the way you want to. There are many games or game structures where society can participate. Otherwise, we will constantly go back to the problem of not finding what you want because money is limited, and more and more so as we move on. Tanya or Andrew, who would like to continue? Well, I would say that Fire for digital art is this business model, but I think that experience is already there. If we could generate an approach, a critical approach to this, no, it seems impossible, but I would say at least related to the software that you need, for example, in art schools. But I don't know, I'm not sure. I suppose the way in which we produce contemporary art is, well, not the way, but we we are aiming at producing practices, but they are not supposed to prescribe the ways in which to produce, but well, generating a reflection like the one that we're having today. I would say that that is the Fire. And black boxes. as well. You know, black boxes that we don't know what happens there. We use those black boxes and we don't question how they work. And there are so many questions that come from art, but we don't get a chance to question that. But we should. We should. We're, you know, looking at the things and for example, we're talking about the digital right now, but in terms of conservation, we have so many problems, I would say, beyond the digital. I think that, yes, fire could be the business model and the water would be criticism and thought. I think it's an oversimplification, maybe, but I think that it is very important to how we are seeing something uh, growing, something like Meta, who is growing, and it's really made up of parts that were useless in the past. You know, any kid right now would be able to create his own meta. Anyone who's able to use Minecraft can program, can model. What was that? Yes, Unity, for example, of course, yes. It's really, you know, the new generations, these very, very young artists, of course, yes. Well, that's a whole new topic. I think there was already a chat about that. There are its risks. You know, it's like, what if the guy forgets to turn on the server? You can't really do anything. Well, um, you know, that is really why you could, you know, collect all of those files into a hard disk drive. But then questions like what is to have really? What does it mean to have, to own a digital piece, for example? That is so relevant today. So many things that are uh, questionable right now. What is the original? What is the copy, for example? And also the practices of NFTs, they are going to produce other ways because there will be money and a certain need to preserve. Although I think there is this need to create a great hype for other needs, I would say, instead of creating really new concepts. This is, of course, out of the hands of everyone. And also, with so many ways to do technology, like quantum computers, for example. You know, it's because in 30 or 40 years, we will, you know, they will see problems that we cannot even uh, think about right now. I would say exactly that, the contingency and all the reality that we're seeing, that is the real fire, I would say, today. And we need to take part of that to be able to live, really. So, yes, how do we negotiate with the entropy? How do we negotiate with entropy from the art and the institutions? That is my question, really. I know, well, it's really the historical moment that we live in. That's what we see. It's every time is the leverage. We're going, you know, from the old to the new, and we're living in this fragile and unstable uh, moment right now. I would add that. I would include that. Yes, I would say that the digital fire is the black boxes. Yes, I agree. I totally agree. We live in this so complex reality where art files are, you know, so you need so much knowledge on how to create an art file when you for example, when you screen a video, the video is slightly corrupted. I'm really very paranoid. I have these huge files with videos and files and PDF, instructions to reconstruct my work, because you do need um, knowledge of how to preserve this art. You really need that knowledge. It's not just art, it's a combination of technology, of knowledge of technology and the creation. And also the condition itself of these circumstances, it can tell you more if they were damaged or not. In a way, it's, maybe this video doesn't have a glitch because it it wasn't well preserved. That is really interesting for me. That is my fire. And for example, um, right now, Facebook and YouTube are, you know, are, you know, used by everyone, but they will get saturated. And what will happen then? Yes, it is very interesting. I personally think that it is a fantasy to imagine that academically and in terms of preservation, I think there are things that are not, there are questions that cannot be answered. And one of those is, what kind of decisions are we going to make? For example, in a physical archive, is there a place? Is there a way to preserve? How are we going to prioritize projects? And how are we going, it's like Derrida said, it's death, the impulse of death, and how we're going to deal with it. Well, we have to deal with it, and we have to dance flamenco the best way we can. Let me ask you this question from the audience, and before the conclusions, if we have any conclusion. I'm sorry, Sol, I wanted to add something. Yes, please. It is also the will of the artist, I think. How can we trust that? We were talking about, we were talking right now, and I thought about Kafka, how he talked to Brom and to ask him to burn all his manuscripts. And it was great that thanks to the fact that he didn't burn those manuscripts, we can know what we know about Kafka. Sometimes, it's really not trusting the artist and saying, how, if you question the artist and you say, because sometimes the artist will say that that work doesn't is not good, and you should question that. I know it's really important. What you said is directly connected to what we're talking about, and how 50 years later we decide that something needs to be known, that the world needs to know, um, and the world needs to see and know, uh, but that has to do with the old. Well, the question says, the view of Andrew seems to jump the technologies that we use, the itinerary of the military, and the possibilities of hacking some cultural practices. Following on Tania and Brian's argument, the archive of art and museums, we could we relate that to a new pop, to a post-internet pop, more like a bad and good game? Could we think about a logic of the punitive capitalism that is absorbed? Who would like to comment something on that question, on that comment? Well, something really quick. I would like to say something that I think it's important that is connected to the new generations. They're changing their platforms and they're interested on the file. And it's the wires that actually allow you to jump generations or to close the gap from generations. For example, talking about digital culture, just thinking and thinking about what has been created in these last 2 years. And this circuit bending, the concept of circuit bending, authors like John Ippolito, practices from gainers, for example, how amateur practices are, how are they used? And, sometimes how to resuscitate a game has to do with not the engineers, but the communities, because they know how to play with that game specifically and not any other game. I would say, yeah, the wiring between generations and practices that allow that to go on, because it's the communities that make documents and works, uh, important. That is why curatorship and the collective curatorship is so important, because you need to decide, okay, well, uh, only one person selected this, and so many people um, decided on this. Well, for example, Kafka is not there anymore to say, um, to have anything to say about his work. So, anyways, amateur practices, I think, are very, very important. Yes, and I would like to say, because, well, I work a lot about the means of production. The means of production are, for me, are the digital images. And the digital images are produced with programs. And to me, that is very, very important. For example, I think of the old schools where they would take images to put them back critically. Something else is what will happen when we reach that ideal digital archive, and who will create that. It will be a dominant archive as well. I think, everyone should start creating their own archive. That is another idea. With all the tools that we have now, we won't have a space for everyone, because in the end, these files and these archives are handled by some people, and it's not possible to cover it all. But I would say that the most important thing would be that each one of us should have and create their own file. What will happen when we have a boom of files, personal files? I would say that like 20 or 30 years later, we were interested in creating and opening new spaces. What will happen when the new generations won't want to talk about independent spaces or whatever name, and they start opening their own files? Brian, would you like to say anything?
Sí, no,
Well,
estaba
yes, I was thinking about the question. I would say that circuit bending is a good image, at least something that where I see myself. Like Andrew was saying, that the idea of tribes, well, I would say there are so many new tribes. with young people, people who are really obsessed with things, and they're conducting research and really, very in a very serious way on very specific topics. There is this whole generation, speaking about Mexico, for example, there is this group with very young people. They're working on all that retro, but uh, they have a new bridge. They're building a new bridge between what is happening right now, and what could happen. It's this space that has to do with interrelations and new spaces. It's a hallucination, really. It's so wild. You have these tribal spaces on the other hand, like Tania was saying, for example, people who are collecting the maps that you could create your own map in these games, but it's all voluntary. It's the tribes of gamers creating maps and so many things. Or for example, people recovering machines like Ataris or Nintendos, or things that had a very short time window, that they were used only for 4 or 5 years, but there are people devoted to recovering those machines or tapes or so many things. It is, you know, they're all separated, but it is part of, the contemporary process of atomization. Um, it happens to me when I think about something. I always find a group of crazy people who are handling, who are working with, it's a tribe living and breathing something, uh, a wild, crazy idea that I just had, and they are already working on it as a tribe, and it's their passion. It's incredible how it works. And I don't know, to close, I would say that the great problem that we have towards preserving things, it's the black boxing phenomena. It's, devices that are legally protected, so you don't uh, you know you don't change anything. Like, even if you can open your cell phone, you won't be able to do anything with it. It's just bits, it's circuits that you won't be able to tamper them at all. The thing with hardware is so difficult right now. So difficult to know that. Yeah, for example, Brian, yeah, I see your monitor, the monitor that you have behind you. That is almost like a sculpture. It's it's an object that it's already so obsolete. It could be a sculpture. I was thinking, of how, you know, obsolescence, for example. What is the difference between buying a mounting instruction manual for a piece, for a different a piece? For example, a mounting instruction that says it needs this, this exhibition needs to be prepared and mounted by a gay man living a crisis in his life right now. For example, that could be an instruction. I think about the resistances, how, the thoughts that we have, and how we could start thinking about phenomenological questions of how things are going on in our lives regarding what Andrew was saying, how there should be a co-responsibility. No institution, no person in specific should be dealing with that on their own. Like Tania was saying, we should communicate all of those atoms, all of those elements to accompany these processes. I also want to tell you, what we need to do with chats like these and the spaces that you defend, for example, what we need to do is we need to put holes through our environment so that we have more air inside. For example, we know, at least we have an idea of what we need. But I do believe that some institutions need a little bit of cracking. They need to have new working conditions for those agents that are very specific. They need to do, it's engineers. It's not something that is, that belongs in the history of art, for example. The world has changed, and we need to communicate using different ways of communication. I was also thinking on the artistic production in the 90s in Mexico. It is difficult for me to think of Rock en tu idioma, for example, that festival that was created, and how the art became second place. And when I listen to you and how the electronic music and raves in the 90s, we've already talked about sounds. Yesterday we were talking about the playlists and bits and vinyls was released. But there are many worries, many things we can worry about, but we are part of a polyphony. We are not able to collaborate with so many specific um, things. But well, anyways, just to close, would you like to say something? We're on our last 5 minutes. Well, yes, I totally agree with what you say. In this time that we're living, of course, we're looking at a change of paradigm in the cultural, the artistic, and the museum is more a mediator than a protector. The museum stimulates and also is part of the creation itself. And maybe that is the future of these institutions. There is no question on the fact that, you have the hard disks, everything is there, Okay, but what are we going to do with those files? Is it worth just having those files? Like, I don't know, dying, waiting for what? Shouldn't we trust the global tribes that they're developing their own things, researching their own things, and maybe wouldn't it be more important to just work on other things? I believe that it has to do with some ideas that were, part of this chat. There is a change in paradigm where we are all part of that. For example, I can think about the virtual life of the files of the archives, but you have the gamers, the person from the catalog. It has to do with the atomization that we were talking about. I would be interested, for example, now that I think about it, I would love to go into a website where I could link all of those possibilities. People who have already conducted some work. I don't want to invent the wheel. I want to support those expressions, and support every group. I don't know, just ideas that are in my mind after this discussion. Thank you so much. Yes, Tania, thank you. Thank you, Tania. Yes, well, I forgot what I was going to say, but anyways, to close, I was thinking, what would be of certain practices in Mexico if it hadn't been for the last generations that did some recovery, for example, Pinto Miraya, or Manuel Rocha, and so many attempts. Oh, yes, now I remembered. If we think about culture as conversations, thinking about Baturana and, you know, an experimental conversation, a- a- an experimental conservation, what would happen if someone from another planet coming on coming to Earth, um, how would how could we have this, the files of conversations, for example, these last 2 years? I think it would be important for the museum to have these conversations alive. I also want to mention Paula Gallardo. She is the mother, the guardian, and so many other things, and the uh, Priamo Lozada archive. And well, she generates ways for the new generations to continue with that work. And it is an archive that cannot be uh, read online. I like that idea because, it is an old archive. It is really old, but it is lucky enough to live in an institution. There is this, Bellas Artes, that Mexican institution caring for this archive. And, well, yeah, the role of these people, so important. And also something that Paula was talking about recently, for example, in anthropology museums, for example, objects that go in and out, the museum preserves them, but the community really uses them for their practices. Some anthropology museums have these objects that are used by the communities, but they are preserved by the museums, and then they go back to the communities to be used. So it's sort of like the same. How do we preserve? How do we continue with the conversation? Not just take a picture of it and that's it. How do we go on with the conversation? Well, yes, I would like to close with a question. It's like archiving what and what for? We should think about the archive not as things stored in a warehouse, but as something with its own agency. Like Brian was saying, when you think about these tribes, these communities with very specific, very specific interests that become niche, I would like to think about the archives as a political tool. Why should we store all that? Why and what for? Yes, well, it's true. There are many ends that could not that we were not able to close. We will have to, well, move on regarding memory policies. I have so many questions in my mind right now, but I would just like to say that it is time to participate, to be a part of fire, but not in an alarming way. And we should not see ourselves like the guardians, but the carers of these archives. I want to thank the three of you. I think it was a very, very interesting chat. We will always have, we will always want more, but I think this was great. I remind you that you can visit the website in muac.unam.mx, Patrimonio Bit. You can listen to the chats, to the old chats and the following chats, all the videos from the previous sessions, and all the activities that we have been preparing. I thank our partners, especially Tecnológico de Monterrey, the university, and also the General Direction of Repositories, the School of Arts and Design, the National School of Preservation, and of course, our scientific committee. It was very attentive in the production and the architecture of this encounter. Thank you so much to all the team, to all the coordination in MUAC. There are so many people working behind this. You know this. Always live events had always some magic because you could talk after the chat, but also the pleasure of being able to collaborate today and having the possibility of other people listening to it weeks or months or years after today. Thank you so much. Goodbye.